Hello, everyone. My name is Jared Goplin. I'm an extension educator in crops with the University of Minnesota Extension, based out of the Morris Regional Extension Office in Western Minnesota. And I'm with you today to talk on an introduction to weed scouting, kind of as the introductory presentation to some follow-ups on weed identification in both broadleaves and grasses, as well as some additional information on herbicide resistance and identifying herbicide mode of action injury symptomology. So before we get too far into this, I wanted to talk a little bit about the definition of a weed. When we talk about scouting for weeds, it really comes down to a matter of perspective in many cases. So when we talk about a weed, we're oftentimes talking about really just a plant out of place, or any plant that's growing in a place that it's not desired. So it is a matter of perspective. And the example I really like to use is a volunteer corn plant that might be growing out in a cornfield. So if you have a cornfield that you planted hybrid seed corn, you have some volunteer corn that might have emerged from the previous year growing in that field. Of course, it's the same species, it's a corn plant. So is that weed, is that plant a weed or isn't it? And it really is a matter of perspective. It's the same species, but in many cases, we still would consider that a weed because that volunteer seed is not going to be as productive as that hybrid seed that you just had planted. And in many cases, it's still undesirable. It's going to cause some yield reductions for that intended crop. So even though it's the same species, it does still kind of fall into that definition of a weed. But it really just is a plant out of place and growing in a place that you might not want it to. So the other thing I like to talk about when we talk about weeds is how they matter. So why do weeds actually matter? Why do we need to scout for weeds? Well, really that's a pretty obvious answer, I guess. And at the end of the day, weeds cost money. So they compete with our crops, obviously, similar to that example with the volunteer corn. That volunteer corn is going to be competing with that intended crop, that hybrid seed corn. It's going to reduce yield, use additional water and nutrients that could otherwise go to that crop. The same thing would be true if you're dealing with Canada thistle or giant ragweed. They cost money to control. Oftentimes we'll use tillage, herbicides, other cultural methods, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, but they do cost money to control. And another picture I really like to use is a photo here on the right-hand slide from Dr. Bill Johnson that really exemplifies how, weed infestations can cause significant issues with equipment wear and tear and weed seed contamination. So we have a combine that's going through a field of corn, and obviously infested with a pretty substantial population of giant ragweed. In that case, obviously that's a lot of material going through that combine that otherwise wouldn't have to be. So it certainly is causing additional equipment wear and tear. And also, if we think about the number of giant ragweed seeds that end up in the combine, end up in that grain sample, I'm sure there was quite a few giant ragweed seeds that ended up there, which then become problematic from a grain quality standpoint, as well as export markets, which has certainly become more of a focus in recent years. So if we talk about scouting for weeds, really that first step, the most important step, is going out to that field and, being able to identify what weeds we're dealing with. I'm not going to go into much detail in terms of actual weed identification here. That'll come up with some follow-up presentations, but we do need to figure out what those weeds are called. And part of the reason is, number one, we need to figure out if that weed actually matters. And the example I like to use there is let's say, for instance, you have that same volunteer corn plant that now is growing, let's say, in an alfalfa field, or a number of other weeds growing in an alfalfa field. In many cases, these weeds, as long as they're not toxic, they actually provide halfway decent forage quality in many cases. So even though it might not be a desirable plant, it might still be a weed in that situation. Do we actually need to control it? Do we actually need to use chemicals or mechanical methods to control that? And in many cases for forages, those weeds, if they're small, are still pretty decent forage quality. So they probably don't necessarily need to be controlled if they're harvested with that forage when they're young. However, if you have other weeds that might be toxic to livestock, obviously that is a case where we really need to control those weeds, where it really does matter in that situation, and we need to control it to prevent any further issues. A couple other characteristics we need to know and why weed identification is important. We need to know if they're annuals or perennials. We need to then, if we can identify these weeds, know a little bit more about these weed species, things like seed production. If we take, for example, a pigweed species like Palmer amaranth or water hemp, they have incredible seed production capabilities where a single plant might produce 500,000 seeds. Some weeds are stimulated to emerge, based on contact with light, for instance. So some weeds, if you go through with a passive tillage, you expose some of those weed seeds to light, they might be stimulated to emerge, which certainly is an important characteristic to know about if we're going to design weed management programs for a certain field. Weed emergence patterns is another important characteristic, especially when we're typically trying to target small weeds. As these weeds get larger, they become much more challenging to control. So knowing when those weeds are going to emerge in the field or having some idea is going to help us, know when to be out in the field and know how quickly those weeds are going to grow before we need to be out there with control strategies. How long do they last in the weed seed bank is another important characteristic, as well as when those viable seeds might be produced. When we get into the discussion of herbicide resistance, that's where we typically would then, more so encourage a zero weed threshold or preventing weed seed production in fields. So knowing when those viable seeds are produced is going to be helpful in managing some of those populations as well. So to help exemplify some of those things I just mentioned, here's a graph or a chart that I had put together, really just showing a typical growing season. So starting on the left-hand side on the bottom axis here, the end of March, and really just going all the way to the end of October. So in this case, the green bars, this is more or less a prediction for much of Minnesota. Obviously, this will change somewhat depending on weather and your location, but it shows kind of a prediction of when these weeds are going to emerge. So kochia, giant ragweed, lamb's quarters typically are emerging earlier. If we go then to the red bars later on, this shows a prediction of when they might be flowering. So if we talk about when viable seeds might be produced, oftentimes that would be sort of the tail end of this red bar. And then on the top, we have the yellow bars that show, more or less when we're going to be out there doing various field operations for alfalfa, small grains, and corn and soybean. So if we think about why these annual weeds listed on the chart here oftentimes are problematic with corn and soybean production, in many cases, it's because they emerge about the same time we're planting those corn and soybean, and they're able to produce viable seeds, at the end of this flowering period before we're harvesting that corn or soybean. So it's really just many of these weeds are really well adapted to that system where they're able to emerge at the right time and produce viable seeds before we're harvesting. And if you contrast those weeds in an alfalfa system where we're cutting that 3 or 4 times a year or maybe more, certainly it's a lot more challenging for those weeds to survive in that system. So being able to identify these weeds and understand some of these weed biology characteristics will certainly be helpful in managing these populations. So again, like I said before, I'm not going to go into too much detail on weed identification, but I do want to talk a little bit about how we classify some of our weeds. So there's a couple of different ways we might classify or talk about our weeds. The first is morphology, and that really comes down to dicots versus monocots, or broadleaf plants versus grasses. And then we also talk about them in terms of a weed life cycle. So annuals, perennials, or biennials. So I'll talk a little bit more about those two types of classification systems here in just a minute. So if we talk about morphology, and this will come in handy, certainly to know, when we talk about herbicides to use, other control strategies, whether it's tillage or cultural methods. But really, we come down to monocots or dicots. So monocotyledons, as the name implies, mono meaning one, has one cotyledon or one embryonic leaf. So that falls into the crops or weeds, grasses, sedges, and rushes fall into that category. As I show on the bottom here, green foxtail is kind of an example of that. If we talk about dicotyledons or dicots, di meaning two, we have 2 cotyledons in that case, would be, typically the broadleaves. So the example there is the giant ragweed seedling, just below here, where we can see those 2 cotyledons that are coming off of that weed seedling right as it's emerging. We talk about weed life cycles. We have annuals, which, like I talked about before, in corn and soybean systems, a lot of times annuals tend to be more problematic because they're well adapted to that system. But annuals really just complete their life cycle in less than 12 months. So they start from a seed and get back to that seed stage within that 12-month period. Biennials will complete their life cycle over the course of 2 years. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in the next couple of slides. And then finally, perennials really are plants that live for more than 2 years. And obviously there's a number of different ways that those plants can spread. Simple perennials can spread, just via that seed process, or we can have a number of other creeping perennials that can produce in addition to seed, perhaps via buds, rhizomes, tubers, bulbs, those types of things, where they're actually able to spread via some alternate methods, which certainly will become really important to know about if we start talking about control strategies. Like the example I often like to use is quackgrass, which is a perennial where if you go through with some tillage, you can break those perennials up and they're able to regrow then. So you're able to spread some of those around via tillage, even though they're not being spread by seed in that instance. So summer annuals, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that life cycle, but really they just germinate in the spring. If we talk about weeds, they're starting from that weed seed bank. As you see in the diagram on the right-hand slide here, they're going to germinate and emerge, grow throughout that summer period, produce viable seeds in the fall, before those seeds then fall back into the soil or perhaps get captured by equipment. Maybe the combine, drives through that weed patch, gets hung up in there. But eventually those weed seeds make their way back into that soil seed bank and eventually start that cycle all over again. So many of our common annual weeds in corn and soybean production, of course, are summer annuals because they really fit well in that system. So lamb's quarters, foxtails, water hemp are some good examples of summer annual weeds. Winter annuals are really the same type of setup. They're completing that life cycle in less than a year. The only difference is winter is happening somewhere in the process of that life cycle. So unlike summer annuals, those weeds typically are germinating from that soil seed bank in that late summer or early fall period. They grow a little bit in the fall, overwinter or go dormant throughout that winter period, and then regrow again in the spring before they flower and produce viable seeds. So some examples there are shepherd's purse, pennycress, chickweed, and a number of others. And oftentimes these are a little bit more problematic in maybe some reduced tillage systems, maybe in some pastures or other types of situations where maybe there's a little bit less disturbance in that fall or early spring period. If we think about winter annuals and controlling them, if we're in a conventional tillage system where we see some fall tillage, maybe some spring tillage, that's a prime period when those plants are going to be growing, which is one of the reasons why fall and spring tillage might not make it very conducive for winter annuals to survive in that system. Biennials then are plants that basically take 2 years to complete that life cycle. So they're going to germinate and form this basal rosette in that first year. And the example I have here on the right-hand slide is a couple of pictures of musk thistle. So that basal rosette is formed in year 1. It's going to survive throughout that winter period. And then it's going to go on and flower and produce seed in that second year. As you see in that bottom photo where that basal rosette in year 1 then eventually will flower and produce viable seed in that second year before it'll die. Some other examples there are wild parsnip and garlic mustard and a number of others. So knowing some of these characteristics about weeds, being able to identify them are certainly some, really basic steps that are very important to scouting for weeds. When we're out in fields though scouting, there's a lot of other things we need to be paying attention to. And it really kind of feeds into how we're going to manage those weed populations. So weed size, growth stage, or the height of those weeds is going to be important. We talk about controlling weeds. It's typically much more easy when they're smaller. So if we talk about especially chemical controlling weeds when they're really below that 4-inch mark is going to be really essential to getting good control in many cases. Paying attention to what type of growth habit they have, summer annuals, winter annuals, or perennials. Keep notes on how severe that infestation is. Is it just a weed here and there? Is it sort of a solid stand? Is there some patchiness to that weed? Do we need to map that weed out? In some cases, especially when we have variable field conditions, It might be that we have some winter annual weeds that are growing, only in one area of the one area of that field. So taking some notes on that and perhaps maybe then utilizing that information to manage that field a little bit differently, more of a site-specific management. Maybe we just have weeds growing in wet areas of the field. Maybe it's areas where the crop has not canopied and has drowned out in recent years, which is where that seed bank is. So in some cases, keeping those detailed notes on other details of where those weeds are really can be helpful in reducing costs of managing those weeds and just being more efficient in many cases. So why is scouting so important? Well, it really is going to feed into management. So keeping all those detailed notes, paying attention to detail in that system is really going to feed into how we're managing those populations. So if we talk then just briefly about weed control strategies, I'm going to highlight kind of 4 main buckets that we talk about. And these buckets are really going to kind of change depending on which weeds we're dealing with and what those growth habits might be. So we're going to talk a little bit about preventing weed infestations, cultural, mechanical, and then chemical control strategies that might be associated there. So the first is prevention. So the one I like to really point out with prevention is really fence line weeds and paying attention to what's going on in the non-cropland areas. So even though it might not be in the field you're scouting, those fence line weeds are oftentimes sort of the start of an infestation. So a good example there is typically giant ragweed, which oftentimes really is pretty prolific in fence line areas. And even though they might not be competing with crops and causing issues in the field, over time, it's pretty easy for those weed seeds to either be spread by wildlife or pulled in by equipment, especially if we think about harvesting soybeans. You might pull a couple of plants from that fence line into the soybean head, gets into that combine, and eventually spreads out into that field. So preventing any of those weeds from developing seeds or progressing into that field, it might be important to then implement some management in those fence line areas to prevent that from happening. We also like to, of course, plant weed-free seed. I also encourage people to think about, manure sources, what types of bedding were used, crop residue or even forage. If you're feeding weedy forage to animals or livestock and then spreading that manure on fields, that certainly can be a way to spread these weed seeds around. We also need to think about cleaning machinery. So, and I have a clip of a YouTube video that the University of Wisconsin has put together, a number of videos on combine cleaning tips to prevent the spread of weed seeds, because all said and done, if we think about some of these very small seeded annual weeds like Palmer amaranth or water hemp, for instance, and have very small seeds, and there's infinite places for those to get hung up in combines. So keeping equipment clean certainly will help prevent the spread of some of these weeds as well. Then if we talk about cultural control methods, cultural methods are oftentimes, ways that we might influence the environment that the weeds are exposed to. So things like row spacing or planting population, cover crops, crop rotation are all going to sort of feed into cultural control strategies. Another one of those is planting date and tillage timing. Timing of herbicide applications can all really be considered cultural methods. And I really have some interesting slides here, or pictures that I'll show here in just a minute, just exemplifying how important cultural control strategies can be in some instances. Mechanical control strategies, that of course is things that are going to mechanically affect those weeds, things like tillage or cultivation, rotary hoeing or mulching, kind of could be considered mechanical, maybe even cultural. Mowing those weeds off in some instances, really any way we're going to mechanically be affecting those weeds. So here's a couple of pictures that I like to share to really show the importance of both mechanical and cultural control strategies. So this is a couple of photos from Waseca a couple of years ago showing the impact of planting date on control of giant ragweed. So the left-hand photo I'll show here in just a second was planted on May 5th. The right one was planted 2 weeks later on May 19th. Of course, normally we like to plant as early as we can to achieve high yield potential. In this case, we're losing about 3% soybean yield potential in that period in Minnesota. But then we're going to come back on the end of June and take a picture of what these plots look like. Now, the pressure, of course, is pretty substantial in these plots. and there was no other weed control strategy implemented, no herbicides in this system or in these photos, just showing what impact planting date can have and pre-plant tillage can have on managing these populations. So the May 5th planting date, obviously there's a pretty substantial population of giant ragweed in that system. I promise there's soybeans planted in there somewhere. But if we contrast that to a 2 weeks later planting date or pre-plant tillage, at least we can row the soybeans in this system. There's still plenty of ragweed there to deal with, kind of getting on the large side to control with herbicides. But if we just compare, what impact that 2 weeks had on weed management, really that's going to make a pretty big impact on how well those herbicides might work, as well as any cultivation or other types of strategies we might be using in this system. And the reason is because, going back to that earlier graph I showed, giant ragweed typically emerges early. In this particular year, only 5% of the ragweed had emerged by May 5th. Wait 2 weeks, over half of the ragweed had emerged by that time. 55% was emerged in the right-hand photo, which meant, about 55% of that was controlled with pre-plant tillage and just set the stage to be a little bit more successful with any other follow-up weed control methods. Then finally, before I wrap up, we have chemical control strategies. Obviously herbicides, and you'll learn a little bit more about that later. Depending on what weeds you're dealing with, selective versus non-selective herbicides will be important. What types you might use, whether it's pre-plant or pre-emerge herbicides, post products. Then knowing what weeds you're dealing with will affect what rates are most effective, which timings are most effective, as well as residual characteristics of those herbicides will be important as well. So to wrap things up, really some keys to success. When we start to scout weeds, we need to be out there early and often. Controlling those weeds when they're small is typically key to limiting yield reductions and long-term weed management. We need to know proper identification. That's really kind of the golden rule of weed scouting, because then we can know whether or not those weeds matter. We can know how weed biology, the growth habit, emergence patterns, and resistance might feed into weed control. And then we need to think about how all of those characteristics play together and think about targeting weaknesses of those weeds. What are areas or characteristics of that weed that might be a little bit more vulnerable? How can we target those and be a little bit more effective in our weed control programs? So with that, I thank you for your attention. And if you have any additional questions, my contact information is listed here. With that, though, thank you.